Benjamin and I will talk about something very new. There's not even a product yet. Okay, I don't know why people are like, oh, there's a new product. No, no, no. How about something that's in the works? There's not even a product yet. If you guys are excited about these things, but I think you recognize the problem is very common. So you'll notice that it's the title is an innovation highlight. I used to have somebody tell me that innovation, nah, it's just experimentation, which is true. This is an experiment. Starts out with an experiment. If it works, then it might become a product. But we want to give you a quick update because I think this is a common challenge by many organizations. So I'm Chi, that's Benjamin, clearly, So it's yeah. We're in a respective product management, have different roles, but when it comes down to this, we're just super excited to work on this. So we'll talk a bit about why devices, and it's making waves. This is just waveform. It's making waves. Appear to be funny, but hopefully. And we're talking about a use case at Mass General Brigham. They're our collaborator. We go way back. And so this is not a sudden thing. It's actually over many years of exploration, so on and so forth. And we'll talk about the data challenges and the platform solutions and just all the things that we have done so far. Some of our implementation partner is sitting right there, so I'm glad that they're here. And without them, we won't be able to be here to talk about. So why device data? So it's interesting. If you think about interoperability, right? People are like, oh, it's FHIR, it's EHR data, but medical device interoperability was a topic from many, many years ago. It's actually way before the so-called EHR interoperability. And the whole idea there is that if the device has this particular piece of data, why can't it be shared with another device or shared with something else? And that was a concept talked about really for many years. But it was very, very challenging actually to really do this. And there was a report a few years ago, and that was probably 10 years ago, and saying that the device maker has no incentive to share data. You're like, interoperability is great, but they have no desire. Because why? I don't get any benefit from it. It turns out the medical device interoperability benefits really is the hospitals. The patient will have lower, shorter length of stay, and there's a lot more efficiency. You don't have to transcribe data, blah, blah, blah. Those are the things that were talked about before. So business-wise, it was very challenging. And then a few things developed over the past few years. This is why now suddenly it's getting a lot of interest. So we're looking at market size could be over $7.4 billion in 2028. And of course, this is just one of the sources. Do you trust it? Maybe not, but it's a big number. The reason is because of the big jump you see from 2023 to 28 is several factors in the marketplace. On the hospital, they're still merging. This is a consolidation that's happening. They want to manage all the devices in the central management tools. They don't want all these devices silos. Basically, the management intention is very clear. All these devices, I should manage all of that. And telehealth was great with COVID. Everything you can do remote, you want to do remote. And therefore, the device data needs to be remotely shared with something else or with some people or some systems, right? Remote patient monitoring is very important, very big. And this is also the technology is amazing. Now you can monitor all kinds of stuff. So the device is getting better. You can do actual remote patient monitoring. And the home care is also another thing, the hospital at home program, the government reimbursed money for it. So it requires devices and lots of devices. If you take the hospital device, take it at home, it's cumbersome. Somebody still had to go to the home to look at it. That doesn't work, right? You want to be able to share the data and also integrate with the EHR, so on and so forth. So the key segments we're looking at in terms of the adoption is looking at the vital signs and patient monitors like the ECG, the telemetry floors with the waveform, the true waveforms. And so there's a lot of value to it. And also another big reason is that now there's all these data scientists, you can predict things, at least they believe they can predict things. So, we need to experiment. But in terms of a key segment, right now, hospital, ambulatory surgical center are still the target. They have lots of devices. And remember, was it yesterday? There was, in Dr. Abuti's presentation, there was the alert fatigue, right? Remember all these devices that can generate alerts? It's just like lots of devices now, right? It's in the hospital, surgical center. North America is still the primary target. and there's so much inefficiency. Just Americans. And there are key players in the marketplace. The Philips and the Capsule, Massimo bought Iserona. One of those are early, pioneers out there. They're making the data available, but did they really solve the problems? Not quite. So the Mass General Brigham, when they came to us, they talk about these two use cases. First one's on the research. Interestingly, 5 years ago, we asked them the same question. There was not so much of interest. And a part of it is that the data science, it was still new. And they're like, okay, could it predict sepsis? Yesterday you heard about sepsis. People talk about predictions for a long, long time. And in this case, they're like, okay, patient was in emergency department for 4 hours. A lot of things could change. If the patient is going to crash, I need to understand which patient is going to crash, but I have very limited data. But the waveform data could actually tell me a lot, right? But the emergency department, I don't know. It doesn't change much what I do. And the data science, I don't know. I don't know nobody that can do data science. But that was 5 years ago. Now it's completely different. So they're looking at, from a research point of view, look at the blood pressure waveform. Could it actually estimate cardiac output, things like that, so that it will do a lot more approximation without an invasive procedure. You can get those parameters. That's very useful. And the Chinese medicine will look at the pulse and figure out everything. Some of these are, I don't believe it, but maybe with this we can validate it, right? On the clinical side, it's a little bit more realistic, just saying that, okay, there are alarm, I want to understand what's happening. But another thing that's very important, which is the main reason people do, is to reduce the false alarm. Things are not real. And you heard yesterday again about alarm fatigue. All these things are beeping. Which one is real? Stuff like that. Those are very challenging from a staff point of view. The volume that we got from Mass General was pretty large. 2.4 million messages, waveform messages per day. Comes down to about 300 messages per second. They send these messages every 5 seconds. So every 5 seconds, there's a huge amount of data basically is generated by their capsule, the broadcaster. They basically send out messages. They don't care whether you can catch it. They just push it out, right? So our job is actually, can we do something, actually catch it, store it, and make it useful for the research scientists and also the clinical users. And so they can actually take advantage of it. And so that's one of the challenge. So what we end up doing is having this particular diagram. No talk without a diagram like this will be worth your attention, isn't it? Right? So on the left-hand side are the devices. And you saw there's a cardiac-related bedside monitors and also infusion pump, all that kind of devices. And in this case, all these data, it may not be the infusion pump, I could be wrong, but there are a lot of device data that are sending these raw data, and including alarms that go through the HL7 gateway, which is capsules, and they have these infrastructure set up. Now they're broadcasting the alarms data, trend data, waveform data, and it needs to be stored. That's what we're trying to figure out. How can we store it? We did an estimation. If we store as is, it's going to be so expensive because the volume is huge, right? And the secondly is that from a consumer point of view, can we help them to get the data, whether it's for a research case or it's for clinical utility at a point of care, say, okay, alarm just went off. I want to look at 3 seconds prior to the alarm, 3 minutes prior to the alarm, right? And all these use cases become fairly useful. And so we start our journey with these challenges. And now let me have Benjamin to continue.
Thank you, Chi. So I'll talk a little, that will help to make progress at least. So I'll talk a little bit about the challenges and then how we're trying to overcome those as part of this innovation project. As Chi already pointed out, this is an R&D engagement that we're doing together with the customer, and that we think holds good promise for future product capabilities. So come and see next year if you're not talking to us about it in the meantime. So Chi already mentioned those HL7 gateways. They already take the serial signals that come physically directly from the devices, and they turn that into HL7 messages that kind of summarize or kind of encode, if you will, the actual waveform or trend data. And you can see that the data arrives in what is called segments. And I've highlighted a couple of things here. So for example, you can see the start and end times of the particular segment. You can see the device ID and some other metadata that came from it. And then the values are encoded in this magical format, values, unit, sampling rates. So those are some other metadata aspects. But as you can see in terms of from an efficient encoding scheme, this is already fairly dense. This is not repeating the timestamp for every single value. This is only giving you the values and letting you infer from the sampling rate and the start time what the corresponding timestamp is. So good job, HL7. So this is already fairly dense, fairly dense way of representing the data, and I'll get back to it why that is important. So, or well, I could just, so if you would translate this in the most straightforward relational table, you would have a timestamp value column, and then and a segment ID, and then from the segment ID, that would be a foreign key into a segment table, and the segment table would have metadata such as the device ID and maybe the patient ID that is actually also somewhere in here. So that's the way how you would typically organize this in a relational way. But imagine what that means in terms of typical relational storage. You're suddenly, from this dense representation, you're suddenly materializing each and every timestamp value in a separate row. That's going to be disastrous. And that's sort of what we try to avoid. So the challenges were high velocity, high volume ingestion. So the data is arriving at a very high speed, and we must make sure that the architecture that we come up with, the storage schema that we come up with, can cope with this and does not have points of contention. For example, you can't have one single point generating the new IDs for the next segment or bucket, because you have 2,000 processes trying to get new IDs constantly. That's gonna break. So you got to make sure that there's enough parallelization in there. The data can arrive in various formats. So we mentioned alerts and trends data in addition to the waveforms themselves. They have different granularity. So so you must make sure that you can deal with that variability. Also, and this is kind of funny, the metadata arrives separately in separate messages. So not all of the metadata, some of the metadata is in the original messages that I saw, that I showed you, but some of the other metadata that is frequently used as part of query criteria may arrive at a completely different time, sometimes before or sometimes after the waveform. That's also somewhat tricky. And then the storage requirements are also diverse, or there's some contradictory things in there. So in order to support fast querying for the clinical or research scenarios, you need to have some good indexing strategies, but having lots of indices means that you're slowing down your ingestion and that you're taking yet even more storage. So we got to try and be very smart there and offer high density storage that can effectively be mapped across a storage tier that is able to sustain the ingestion rate, and a storage tier that is cost effective for the long-term storage for the clinical, for the research scenarios. The time latency is not as much of an issue. All right, so what did we do? We looked at globals, because that's what we do here at InterSystems. So this looks a little dense perhaps, but this is sort of how we organized the data structure. And to meet those requirements, the fast ingestion, avoiding contention points, being able to map across storage tiers, etc., we're having 4 different levels of cutting up the data. And I'll take you through those from left to right. So first, the partition level. That's what we're going to do for mapping data across storage tiers. So that's going to be some coarse-grained time indications, such as year, month, day, or maybe just year, depending on what your requirements are. The segment information is also important. The segment level represents how you get how the data arrives. So this is where the metadata, what the metadata applies to. So it's important that you're able to filter or segment on those. Those are two logical criteria. They still make sense. The other two here, they only make sense to the engineers. They don't make sense to the clinicians, researchers, or operators. So buckets are a mechanism that we're introducing in our table partitioning capability that we hope to make available later this calendar year. So buckets are meant to offer fast ingestion to reduce the chance of any contention points. It's just a way for us to store the data. If you're familiar with the deep internals of our Iris BI solution, and I know that at least one person here in the first row is, we've already pioneered the idea of bucketing there as well a long time ago, because there we also have some similar requirements. So buckets is just a way for a parallelization level that helps us meet these fast ingestion. And then the last level is chunks. So chunks are sort of units of 64,000 values that we use also in our bitmap indices, in our columnar storage. So that was to align with some of the existing infrastructure that we had. And then the values are on the other side. For that, we'll use the $vector encoding. So the $vector encoding, as Jeff also pointed out earlier today, is something that we're finding other use cases for. This was introduced initially for implementing columnar storage, but it's now also the backbone or the encoding format for our vector search, vector embeddings. And it's also absolutely applicable here in the time series waveform context. So what does $vector buy us? $vector buys us a highly optimized file, a highly optimized way of storing the data. So I'm comparing it here with HDF5. HDF5 is a typical format used by researchers in academia to store time series data, and they consider that to be fairly dense ways of storing the data, and it's organized in a way that you can efficiently query it. So that's different from the HL7 story. If we're storing those 7 gigabytes on Iris, we end up with 4 gigabytes, and that's still with a known efficiency gain that's ahead of us. So our timestamp vectors, we know that they take more space than they should if we would use delta encoding or double delta encoding. So those are some things that we're going to be working on in the next 6 months or 12 months. The data vectors, we've got some IDs there to segregate those per data type to also offer more tailored encoding. And then for the index structures, which are only a small slice of this, we're already using a Bloom filtering approach that just tells you which buckets might have values. But if there's any value that matches your criteria, you know that they're included in the Bloom filters. That's a typical indexing strategy that's used in very large database systems, and that's totally applicable here. And the reason why the indices slice here is super small. All right. So we want to make this data available. So, and because, well, that's sort of my pet peeve is making things available is SQL. SQL is a super flexible language to query data, to make data available. There are probably use cases that we can support in very explicit, very focused APIs, but we always like to have a way to get to the data with SQL, because then you can anticipate the scenario that you didn't think of when you wrote your API at first because of the genericness of it. So what we're doing is we're using our old school custom storage definitions to project that global structure into SQL so that you can query the individual data points, you can query the bucket level, you can query the segment level. So all of those are available for SQL access. What we're doing with, I call it custom work right now, as we're continuing to turn this experiment into product, will be translated into something that's more, let's say, under the hood and more standardized. All right, we're almost at the end. So just wanted to flash by 2 examples of queries. So this is a clinical scenario where you want to look back in the recent past. So you're querying for something that happened in the last 3 minutes, and you're just using very simple SQL queries. And this is a slightly more complicated query. That's a research query that combines a waveform and an alert stream. But it's all expressible in SQL. You can argue that, well, that's a pretty decent statement. That takes me a minute or two to write. But if you look closely, I highlighted the pieces that are the parameters in here, the pieces that are going to be variable if researcher A asks a question or researcher B asks a question. So what we're now working on for MGB is to sort of templatize these queries such that they have a way of getting to the data without having to write any SQL themselves. Wrapping up, sort of where are we now? We feel that we're in a good spot when it comes to meeting the ingestion rate requirements that we're aware of for this customer. We've got pretty high density storage right now, and we know we've identified a couple sub-projects that can take that a step further even. And then we have a means to get to the data in a fairly efficient way with those templated queries. And what is next is kind of deliver this in a usable way to the customer. And then we're going to be talking about sort of the next phase at MGB. And we're looking forward to also start talking to a couple more customers that have a very concrete use case that we can explore together, so that we can sort of productize it based on a broader set of requirements than MGB, who we know really well and who have a very demanding volume scale requirements. But on the functional side, we're going to make sure that we meet a broad set of use cases. With that, we're sort of at time. Chi has to present next door right after this.
If you want to show the final survey. Yeah.
So if you have a question, feel free to ask now, or otherwise find us in the museum, or find us tomorrow in the course of the day. By all means, thank you so much.